Hi, I'm Ryan with Here for History, and today I'm doing something a little bit different. I'm reviewing Death by Lightning on Netflix. If you're asking yourself, why am I doing this? Well, it's a history show. I'm a history channel. I like the show. I wanted to talk about it. Simple enough. The review also isn't too far removed from my Historian Learns About series, because I learned a lot reading the book the show is based on, and watching the show. So, I'll talk about what I learned. I will also cover where the show and the book differ. I will also talk about what I liked, what I didn't like, and anything else I find interesting. Pretty typical review. Hopefully you enjoy what I do. But if not, you can hate me and I will go cry in the corner. You know, the usual. But if you do like it, I may do more of these because there's a lot of history shows. Death by Lightning came out on November 6, 2025, which means I am not too quick on my review. Oops. It is based on the 2011 book by Candice Millard called Destiny of the Republic. The book is fantastic, and I would encourage anyone to read it. It honestly was one of the easiest reads I've had in a while for both nonfiction and fiction. Just go read the book. You won't regret it. The book and show both cover President James Garfield's nomination, campaign, election, and death. Well, truthfully, the book covers more than that. Millard covers Garfield's early life as well as his time in the Civil War. If you didn't read the book, I don't think you realize just how ardent an abolitionist Garfield was or his position on equality for freed slaves. He was pushing for equal voting rights and equal treatment. However, I get why the show didn't get into these intimate details. You'll hear me say this a lot, but there's only so much you can fit into a 4-episode show. Things need to be cut. Instead of covering Garfield's past and his political positions, Death by Lightning has Garfield interacting with noted historical figures Frederick Douglass and Blanche Bruce. The show has Garfield treat them as equals, which is a great way of showcasing not only his personality, but his political stances. I think I heard somewhere, show don't tell. Guess that makes sense for a show. Before I go further, let's back up and go to where I really wanted to start, which is the acting. The casting was awesome. The people in the show look like their real world counterparts. Go look at pictures of Garfield, Godot, and especially Chester A. Arthur, and then go look at the stills of the cast. They look like the same people. I love that. Michael Shannon as Garfield was excellent. Michael Shannon kind of got known for his presence on screen, and he uses that to nail Garfield. Garfield has to do that famous nomination speech for Sherman, which was real, and he delivers it perfectly. In every interaction, you buy into what he's saying. There's an earnestness to his acting. I'm not going to be sitting here commenting on someone's acting overall, just not my skill set. I could barely read what I put on this prompter, but I just wanted to acknowledge that Shannon is that good. I also wanted to highlight Shea Wiggum as Roscoe Conkling and Matthew McFadden as Charles Godot, because I think they have the toughest jobs, at least in my opinion. We'll start with Shea Wiggum, because I think Conkling is one of the more complicated characters. He had some positive characteristics. He was an abolitionist, so that's great. But he was also kind of a jerk. He had extramarital affairs. He was a big fan of the spoil system, taking advantage of it for his own personal power. Also had no problem outmaneuvering people and ruining their lives. So, he is kind of a jerk, but he holds some good views too. I think it's a tough character to play. Plus, as I pointed out, there's only 4 episodes. So how do you get such a complex man in 4 episodes? Especially when he is one of the 2 villains. Gateau and Conkling are essentially the villains of this show. Well, in the show he's a bit over the top, but I think that was done to get across quickly what kind of man Conkling was. I could see people going 2 ways on that. I could see some people saying, I didn't really like how outrageous he was at times. Others would just be entertained by his antics. Either way, I don't think you can fault the actor. I think he did a fantastic job of doing what he was asked. The other tough job is Matthew McFadden as Charles Godot, the villain of all villains in this story, the assassin of James Garfield. Spoiler if you didn't know that. Godot had to be challenging to play since, for lack of a better term, Godot was insane. Death by Lightning does his best to showcase his insanity. He had delusions of grandeur, but on a ridiculous scale. And he always thought he was in on the next big thing. He truly convinced himself he was part of the reason Garfield got elected. And he truly convinced himself that by killing Garfield, he was saving the Republican Party and then saving the country. He thought he was sent on a mission from God. He truly believed these things. And Matthew McFadden does an excellent job of showcasing the madness. It's not a caricature of a person who's in that state. It's a very well-grounded delivery of this crazy Charles Godot who believes these things. And I can't express how well it's acted. It starts at a good pace with him too, because you get him coming out of jail and meeting his sister. He gives this wonderful speech in jail where you think, oh, maybe he's got a head on his shoulders. And then you just see his descent. The big difference between the show and the book is that the book has more time to cover all aspects of his life and his insanity. And man, he was something else. The show has him at the Onita Free Love Commune and his paper, but they don't talk about his life as a wandering preacher. But again, Death by Lightning did its best to cover how didn't pay for anything and he struggled. You have one scene where his luggage was tossed out a window and one where he walks out of a meal. However, in the meal scene, he looks into his wallet and sees he has no money. It's almost like he forgot he was poor. In reality, he had been walking out on things for years and knew he was never going to pay. I also don't think they focused enough on how much money he would borrow and just not repay, but I get it, they had limits. Luckily, the acting was fantastic, so you knew who Godot was. Let's go to the nomination scenes from the show. What actually was happening. To summarize quickly, Garfield was brought in to nominate John Sherman for the Republican candidate for president. The show gives you glimpses of other speeches, such as a funny one where James Frederick Joy nominated James Blaine but used the wrong middle initial. He said S instead of G. This happened. In real life, Blaine did comment on the snafu, but I don't think he commented quite as aggressively as the show had him do. Also, James Blaine, played by Bradley Whitford, is probably one of the least developed of all characters, to be quite honest. He's kind of Garfield's right-hand man through most of it, and he's just kind of a side piece. But back to the speeches. Death by Lightning then has Roscoe Conklin nominating Ulysses S. Grant, which is one of the times where I stopped and said, wait, Grant was trying to run for a third term? It was something that I think was in the back of my head, but because he didn't win the nomination, it never really sticks. It just won't adhere to my brain that he tried for a third term. Conklin was nominating Grant because Grant was basically willing to do what Conklin wanted. Also, Grant supported the spoil system. The spoil system was where the government officials gave their friends all these cushy jobs, even if they weren't qualified. It's a big deal, and it's the one thing Conklin doesn't want to get rid of. Anyway, Conklin had a good speech in which he said his candidate is from Appomattox. That's true to life, and that's a great line to use. And then steps up Garfield to deliver his nomination speech for Sherman. The irony here is that most of the speech has nothing to do with Sherman. The speech is important because the whole idea is that the speech wows the crowd of Republicans so much that in the end it leads to his nomination. There's even a moment in the speech where Garfield is covering the list of things we want, and someone yells, "We want Garfield." That actually happened. The show has Sherman confronting him, saying he's never been so embarrassed. Sherman saying to Garfield, like, how dare you? You don't do that speech if you don't want to be president. But I think this is where the show does a little bit of a disservice to Garfield, for two reasons. One, Sherman ended up giving his votes, and likely anyone supporting him, to Garfield. So even if he wasn't happy, he went with the flow. Second, Millard in her book points out that Garfield was prone to long-winded speeches. He just was. It was almost a running joke that he would give these super long speeches. He even made jokes at his own expense about it, saying that he talked too much. So it was not out of character for him to go up and give this really long speech for what could have been a couple second introduction. It's just who Garfield was. If you asked him to give the introduction, you knew what you were getting. I'm not going to fully say that I know what was in Garfield's mind, but all indications are that he wasn't looking for presidency at that point. He just liked to talk. He liked to give speeches. And he happened to be very good at it. So that's what happened. I wish the show had addressed a little bit that Garfield just really liked to talk, but I get it. From there, Death by Lightning does a great job of highlighting the voting sequences and the political games at play. Garfield's nomination was a mix of winning people over with his speech and politicians playing against each other. The show let us know that Conklin and Blaine don't like each other, and it's through that dislike that Garfield benefited. In a somewhat comedic sequence, we are introduced to Chester A. Arthur, who is played by Nick Offerman. Also, for any Conan O'Brien fans out there, he used to have a segment called Nick Offerman for Parks and Recreation reads tweets from young female celebrities. Something just like I did, probably better. And it's all I could think of when I see Nick Offerman. So just remember that. I like that the show quickly established Arthur was Conklin's man, and a bit of a leg breaker for Conklin. Sure, he was the collector of the Port of New York, which he got through the spoil system from Conklin, but he was also a muscle for Conklin. It's a great introduction for a person who plays a big role in everything. There is no way the show could fully cover the relationship between Arthur and Conklin, like Arthur living with Conklin, so I think they handled it perfectly. The show is pretty true to the book that Arthur was selected as vice president, basically to steal someone from Conklin's camp. Book and show stay faithful to each other. So we go into campaigning. I thought it was a little odd the way they treated Garfield in the campaign, because Garfield in the show said, "I'm going to campaign from my front porch." which, okay, but as Millard points out in the book, at least in 1880, it was seen as below the president to go campaign for himself. He couldn't be the one out there. So Garfield really should not have been campaigning. Maybe it's giving a little bit more credit to Garfield than necessary. At least that's how I see it. It could also just be showcasing the love between him and his wife, which is very important. Death by Lightning does the best it can to help the viewer understand that they're truly in love. Once again, the book has more details, but I don't think it harms the show. There is a great scene where Garfield meets some former Black Union soldiers and say, "I'd rather be with you and lose than against you and win," which is an absolute real quote from Garfield. He was very much for equality. So, another good way to showcase his personality and his beliefs. The show then gets into Garfield's presidency. It highlights his issues with Conkling, namely Conkling killing off his nominations for cabinet. Not literally. But there is one particular scene where they basically kidnap a guy and put him in a warehouse to yell at him for taking a cabinet position. Conkling and Arthur were both there. The guy then leaves and turns down the position. Really fun stuff. And in the book. While all the political stuff is fascinating, and probably why you'd keep watching, I want to highlight Nick Offerman, Parks and Recreation, and his development of Chester A. Arthur. Arthur starts out as firmly in Conkling's camp, but over the course of the show, you see him grow more into his own and start to distance himself. Offerman's ability to let the viewer see Arthur change is great. Arthur really did change a bit in real life too, so it matches what happened. The show also has several scenes dedicated to the numerous job seekers Garfield entertained. The show doesn't really cover it, but Millard explains that the president was expected to be available to the public. We're a democracy. They've elected you, you should be accessible to them. As a result, you get a scene where Garfield meets all these people asking for jobs that they very much do not qualify for and should not get. But hey, at least they took the chance. This also really did happen. Godot plays an important role in these scenes because he keeps calling on Garfield. First, he wanted to be ambassador, I think, Austria, and then I think he switched it to France. Godot genuinely believed he got Garfield elected and was owed. All the waiting and being pushed to the side played negatively on his psyche, and that's very important. Furthermore, the president and other politicians were also supposed to be just as accessible to people on the street. So keep that in mind. Death by Lightning overplays the relationship between Arthur and Godot. The show would have you believe Arthur helped Godot with the police. I don't remember reading that in the book. I think the show included scenes like that because it's very tough to showcase Godot making up his own relationships with people, his own delusions. And Death by Lightning had to let the audience know that Godot liked Arthur, because the impetus for shooting Garfield involved Godot believing Garfield was under the bad influence of Blaine and that Arthur would set things right. Like I just pointed out, Millard expertly explained that politicians in the 1880s were expected to be available to the public. The idea was, if you don't like the guy, you can vote him out. So there's no need to worry about assassinations. That idea was not a great one. We lost 3 presidents in under 40 years. But this is why Garfield was in public, unguarded, and able to be shot in the back by Godot. Honestly, the shooting scene is relatively quick, all things considered. They move on very quickly from it. The show moves on to the medical side of things, namely trying to save Garfield's life. I think the book does a better job overall in this regard. For anyone who doesn't know, Millard concludes that Garfield would have survived the shot and been fine if the doctors had done nothing. The bullet lodged itself in a safe space surrounded by fat. However, instead of doing nothing, the doctor in charge, Willard Bliss, did a lot of things. He probed the wound with his finger a lot, which was ungloved. He kept trying to retrieve the bullet. He gave Garfield lots of alcohol, which dehydrated him, and he tried to feed him through an enema. The show includes a black doctor who was a former Union surgeon who mentioned sterilization techniques being developed by Joseph Lister, a British doctor. Bliss shot these down. In reality, there was no one doctor talking to Bliss about this, but a group of young doctors trying to advise Bliss. The show couldn't fit everyone into it, so it boiled everyone down to one person. Pretty typical thing for TV shows to do. What is true is that Bliss did not believe in Lister's technique. Many American doctors did not embrace it yet. The show tries to give the idea that Bliss was possessive of control, but I think the book does a much better job of explaining the heights of Bliss's paranoia. Bliss had been under some bad press and was hopeful that saving Garfield's life could resurrect his career. He would let no one see Garfield. Afterwards, people couldn't figure out how Bliss even got control. It just kind of happened. He was brought in by Robert Todd Lincoln, Lincoln's son, because Bliss and Garfield were friends and Bliss was close. But by no means was he supposed to have full control. It's just wild that it happened. Garfield's death scenes are tough to watch, but for the right reason. They're very sad, and he knows he's going to die. It's all very well done. Death by lightning then moves on to the hanging of Charles Godot. There is something the show doesn't cover, which is Godot trying to get out of his sentence via an insanity plea. Well, actually, first he thought Arthur would free him, but that didn't happen. So when it didn't, he went with insanity. I don't mind the show not really covering this. It only muddied the waters. There's a lot of good about Godot's mental state that I think is still a mystery today. I bet you would just be introducing the creator's own ideas into things if they tried to answer the question of Godot's insanity. I say this because there's absolutely an idea where you can have delusions, but know right from wrong. And we don't know Godot's mind that well. One thing I didn't like that the show included was a moment where Lucretia Garfield comes and meets with Godot right before he's about to be hanged. She gets a moment of triumph where she tells Godot that he will be forgotten in the annals of history. The moment never happened. It's a feel good section in the show, but I think it does a disservice to Lucretia, who was dealing with grief and her children, not revenge. Truthfully, there's a couple scenes in the show that they could have gotten rid of, including multiple at the Oneida commune and one involving a politician and a prostitute. Felt like since the creators were the Game of Thrones guys, they just had to get some stuff in. Just didn't fit for me, not this show. Overall, though, I love the show. The acting, the setting, it was all so well done. In the end, I think the character that was best developed was Chester A. Arthur. His character starts as a leg breaker, but by the end, you're cheering for him. I didn't really know much about Arthur besides being a mediocre president, but I think the show does very well by him. I really hope you all read the book and watch the show. They're both excellent. If you like this, I'll do more of them. If not, like, subscribe, do all that fun stuff. Thanks, guys.